1984, a father and his young daughter set off from Austin, Texas, for what was supposed to be a simple weekend drive. They never came back. For over 16 years, their disappearance remained a heartbreaking mystery until a discovery in a scrapyard changed everything. That afternoon, warm autumn light streamed through the living room windows of Margaret Holbrook's home in Austin. Shadows stretched across the wooden floor as she sat motionless on the floral couch, gripping the TV remote like it was the only thing holding her together. Her mother, Doris, sat quietly beside her, both women bracing themselves for what had become a painful ritual. Every year on this date, Margaret paid local stations to broadcast a missing persons alert, and every year she watched, hoping for something, anything. "It's almost time," Margaret whispered, barely audible, as she turned up the volume. The news came on. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen. A familiar image appeared. A smiling man with a thick mustache, standing beside a bright-eyed little girl. Next to them, a shiny red Cadillac. The anchor's voice broke through the silence. Today marks 16 years since Jim Holbrook and his 8-year-old daughter Lucia vanished during a weekend road trip. They were last seen driving a 1979 red Cadillac DeVille, license plate THB 143. If you have any information, please contact the Austin Police Department. Margaret switched off the TV. The silence that followed felt heavier than the years that had passed. Her mother rose from the couch. "I'll go freshen up," Doris said gently, squeezing her daughter's hand before heading upstairs. Alone now, Margaret walked to the bookshelf, her fingers running across worn spines until they found a familiar leather photo album. She brought it back to the sofa and opened it with the kind of care reserved for sacred things. Inside, still frames of the life she once had, Jim beaming beside his prized Cadillac, Lucia on her first day of school, the three of them smiling by Barton Springs. She gently touched her daughter's face in one of the pictures. "Where are you?" she murmured, the same question she had asked 1,000 times before. The sudden ring of the phone jolted her back to the present. She rushed to the kitchen. "Hello?" she answered, her voice catching slightly. "Mrs. Holbrook, this is Officer Daniels with the Austin Police Department," came the voice on the other end. "We've received a report about something found at a junkyard in San Marcos. It could be linked to your husband and daughter's case." Margaret gripped the counter, steadying herself. "What kind of something?" "We'd prefer to explain in person, ma'am. We can have a patrol car there in about 10 minutes to take you to the site." "Yes," Margaret said at once, her heart hammering. "Yes, I'll be ready." She hung up and rushed to the stairs. "Mom," she called, "the police found something. They think it's connected to Jim and Lucia." Doris appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale. "What did they say?" "They didn't give details, but they're sending a car." 10 minutes. Doris nodded and descended quickly. "I'm coming with you." Minutes later, a patrol car arrived. Officer Martinez greeted them, but offered little conversation on the long, silent drive to San Marcos. Margaret stared out the window, her mind spiraling. Doris sat beside her, clutching her purse like a lifeline. When they arrived at Harrove's Auto Salvage, the sight of yellow tape and police vehicles made Margaret's stomach churn. Officer Martinez led them past rows of wrecked cars to a small group gathered in the distance. "Detective Reyes," Martinez called out. "Mrs. Holbrook and her mother are here." A tall man in plain clothes turned to greet them. "Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett. I'm Detective Reyes. Thank you for coming." Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "What did you find?" Reyes stepped aside, and there it was, smashed and almost unrecognizable, but still unmistakably, the red Cadillac DeVille. The once shiny paint was now faded, chipped, and streaked with rust. But Margaret had no doubt. This was Jim's car, the one he had saved for years to buy, the one he treated like a family member, the one he and Lucia drove off in that weekend. and never came back. "Oh my God," Doris whispered beside her, gripping Margaret's arm tightly for support. Margaret stepped toward the vehicle, moving as if in a trance. The Cadillac had clearly been partially crushed, likely by the excavator now parked ominously nearby. Officers were taking photographs from every angle. Others were combing through the debris surrounding it, measuring, documenting, searching. "We haven't opened the interior. It's too badly damaged," Detective Reyes said gently. "But we need to ask, can you confirm? Is this your husband's car, Mrs. Holbrook?" Margaret walked around the wreck slowly, her eyes scanning every bent piece of metal, every familiar line. Then she stopped, crouching slightly by the rear passenger side. "There," she said, pointing to a small dent on the chrome hubcap. "Jim hit a curb a week before they left. We were going to fix it." Her voice trailed off. She stood up, blinking back tears that refused to fall. "Yes," she said quietly. "This is it. This is their car." Detective Reyes gave a solemn nod, then motioned to a man standing nearby, nervous, wiping his hands on a rag. "This is Dean Lom," he said. "He owns the junkyard. He's the one who called it in." Dean stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry. I didn't know the story behind the car. I swear, it was on the schedule to be crushed this morning. I saw the missing persons segment during lunch and I recognized it right away. I called the police immediately." Margaret didn't take his hand. "How did it get here?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "Who brought it in?" Dean shifted uncomfortably. "That's the strange part. There's no record of it. No paperwork. It's not in our system at all." "That's not just strange, that's suspicious," Doris said firmly. "Mr. Lom isn't under suspicion," Reyes cut in calmly. "He came to us voluntarily, but we do need answers." "I've been asking the same questions," Dean said. "We're strict with our intake. Paperwork, ID, signatures, always. I don't know how this one slipped through." Just then, a woman in greasy overalls approached. "I saw Reed bring it in," she said. All heads turned. "Reed?" Detective Reyes asked. Dean nodded. "Reed Caraway, my partner. He handles the mechanical side. Head tech here." Reyes pulled out his phone without hesitation. "We need to speak with him right away. Can you call him?" Dean dialed. After a few tense moments, he shook his head. No answer. "I need his home address," Reyes said flatly. Dean pulled out a small notepad, scribbled an address, and handed it over. "He lives in South Austin." Reyes passed the info to a nearby officer. "Send a unit. Bring him in for questioning." He turned back to Dean. "Is there anything else of Reed's on the property that we should be aware of?" "His office," Dean replied. "But it's locked. Only Reed has the key." "We'll get a warrant," Reyes said, signaling another officer. "Start the process." Margaret said nothing. Her eyes remained locked on the crushed Cadillac, as if it still held some secret it hadn't yet given up. 16 years of waiting, searching, hoping for answers. And now the car was here, but no sign of Jim, no sign of Lucia. "Let's start a full search of the area," Reyes ordered. "Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett, if you're willing, your help could be valuable. Anything that might have belonged to them, you'd recognize it." Margaret simply nodded, and the two women joined the officers as they began to sift through the scattered wreckage of the yard. Hours dragged on as they scoured scrap piles and rusted debris, but nothing surfaced. No bags, no clothing, no remains. Eventually, they stood outside a locked metal door marked Reed Private. They were waiting now for either Reed himself or the warrant that would grant access. Margaret leaned against the wall, drained and motionless. Doris stood beside her, one arm wrapped around her shoulders. Neither spoke. The sun climbed higher overhead, casting sharp midday light across the junkyard. Then, 2 police cruisers rolled in. A third vehicle followed behind, a dark blue pickup truck. It stopped a short distance away. A man in his mid-20s stepped out. He had short brown hair, grease-stained work clothes, and the Junkyard's logo stitched over his chest pocket. Reyes walked straight toward him. "Mr. Carraway?" The man looked puzzled. "Yeah, that's me. Is something wrong?" "We need to speak with you," Reyes said. His tone left no room for misunderstanding. "I'm Detective Reyes," the man said, offering his hand. "We're investigating the arrival of a red Cadillac on your lot. It's tied to a missing persons case from 16 years ago." Reed's face changed slightly, a flicker of realization. "You mean the one that got crushed this morning?" he asked. "Dean told me you guys were called." Reyes gave a small nod and gestured toward the two women beside him. "This is Margaret Holbrook and her mother, Doris Barrett. The vehicle belonged to Mrs. Holbrook's husband. He vanished, along with their daughter, 16 years ago." Reed approached the women with a respectful expression. "I'm so sorry to hear that. Reed Carraway," he said, offering his hand. Margaret hesitated, then shook it briefly. "The vehicle wasn't entered into your system," Reyes continued, "and one of your co-workers said she saw you bring it in. We need to know how it ended up here." Reed sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, that was an odd one. About a week ago, an older guy showed up when Dean wasn't around, said he didn't need the car anymore and just wanted it gone." "Did he give you a name?" Reyes asked. Reed shook his head. "No, that's what felt off. He paid in cash, more than usual. When I asked for ID and the usual forms, he just walked off, left the keys in the ignition, and disappeared. I tried to stop him, but he was gone." "Can you describe him?" Reyes asked, his tone sharpening. Reed thought for a moment. "Tall, maybe 6 feet, thin build, gray hair, but it looked like it used to be dark. He had a thick mustache, glasses, wore khaki pants and a button-down shirt. Quiet voice, almost hard to hear him." Margaret suddenly inhaled sharply. "That sounds like Jim," she whispered to her mother, her voice shaking. "What?" Doris said too loudly. "No, that's not possible." Reyes turned toward them. "Mrs. Holbrook, are you saying the man he described could be your husband?" Margaret nodded slowly, her hands trembling. "It fits. The height, the mustache, the way he dressed. Jim never wore t-shirts, not even on weekends." Reyes turned back to Reed. "How old would you guess he was?" "Hard to say," Reed answered. "Maybe in his 50s. Could have been younger. He looked worn out." Doris shook her head, visibly upset. "That doesn't make sense. Jim loved that car. Why would he get rid of it like that?" "And after all this time," Margaret added, her voice growing stronger, 16 years? And still no word from him or Lucia. If that was really him, why now? Reyes held up a calming hand. "Let's not jump to conclusions. There's still a lot we don't know, but we'll get to the bottom of it." He turned back to Reed. "We'd like to look inside your office. One of your co-workers mentioned it's kept locked." Reed nodded. "Sure. Nothing to hide. We keep tools and inventory records in there. I'll take you." As they walked toward the office building, Margaret and Doris exchanged quiet, anxious glances. "Do you really think that could have been Jim?" Doris whispered. "I don't know," Margaret replied. "It sounds like him, but why would he abandon the car after all this time? Where's Lucia? I just don't believe he'd do this." "Maybe it wasn't him," Doris murmured. "Maybe someone's trying to throw us off." At the end of a narrow hallway, Reed pulled out his keys and unlocked the door, stepping aside to let Detective Reyes go in first. "Please wait out here," Reyes said to Margaret and Doris. "We'll let you know if we find anything important." As the police began their search inside, Doris suddenly clutched her chest, her face contorted with pain. "Mom?" Margaret said in alarm. "What's wrong?" "My asthma," Doris gasped, fumbling in her purse. "The stress, My inhaler! Margaret helped her mother to a nearby bench, finally finding the inhaler buried deep in her bag. She watched nervously as Doris took several deep breaths. "I'm okay," Doris said after a few minutes, her voice still shaky. "Just overwhelmed. I'm sorry." "Would you like medical help?" Reyes asked, hurrying over. "No," Doris insisted. "I just need to sit." Meanwhile, the officers inside continued their search. One by one, they brought out items, asking if anything belonged to Jim or Lucia, but Margaret shook her head each time. After nearly an hour, Reyes emerged from the office again. "We've finished," he told them. "Unfortunately, we didn't find anything that directly links back to your husband or daughter." Margaret's shoulders sagged. "So, we're still nowhere?" "Not exactly," Reyes replied. "Finding the Cadillac is a breakthrough. Now we need to figure out who left it here, and why." He turned to Reed. "Mr. Caraway, we'd like you to come to the station and give a formal statement." Reed nodded without hesitation. "Of course, whatever you need. If there's anything more I can do to help, just say the word," Reed offered. "We'd appreciate it if you both came to the station," Detective Reyes said, looking at Margaret and Doris. "We want to go over the case again, see if anything new stands out in light of the Cadillac turning up." "We'll come," Margaret replied without hesitation. "I'll take my own truck," Reed added. "I'm heading back toward Austin anyway." Reyes considered that for a moment, then gave a nod. "That's fine. We'll expect you at the station within the hour." As they walked back to the patrol car, Margaret kept a steady hand on her mother's arm. "Are you sure you're up for this?" she asked quietly. Doris gave a gentle squeeze. "I wouldn't miss it. If there's even a chance we'll find out what happened to Jim and Lucia, I have to be there." They climbed into the back of the cruiser, watching as Reed started his pickup. The sun was high and bright now, casting harsh shadows over the crushed red Cadillac as they pulled away from the junkyard. Inside the Austin Police Department, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in a small conference room. Margaret and Doris sat across from Detective Reyes and another officer, while Reed had been taken to a separate room to give his full statement. "Let's go through the timeline again," Reyes said, opening a thick folder. "Sometimes new details emerge when we look at the past with fresh eyes." Margaret nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Jim and Lucia left on a Saturday morning, October 12th, 1984. Jim had built up a successful dental practice here in Austin. He had his quirks, his loud ties, that mustache, but his patients adored him. "And Lucia?" Reyes prompted. Margaret's face softened for a moment. She was 8, so bright, so full of energy. She followed Jim everywhere when she wasn't in school. "You didn't go with them?" the second officer asked, jotting notes. "No," Margaret replied. "My mom needed help that weekend. She was reorganizing after my father passed. It was only meant to be a quick overnight trip. Jim wanted to show Lucia the fall colors out near Llano, maybe stop by Enchanted Rock. They were supposed to be home Sunday evening." "When did you first feel something was wrong?" Reyes asked, though the file in front of him likely already had the answer. "Sunday night," Margaret said. "Jim had promised to call once they left Llano. When I didn't hear anything, I called the motel. They said he and Lucia had checked out that morning. I called everyone, friends, family. Nobody had seen or heard from them. By Monday morning, I went straight to the police." Doris reached over and squeezed her hand. "We've been searching ever since." Reyes nodded slowly. The original investigation was extensive. Officers checked gas station footage, talked to motel staff, people in nearby towns, but there was no activity on Jim's credit cards, no movement in his accounts. His office remained untouched. "Things were different back then," the second officer added. "No cell phones, fewer cameras. We did everything we could with what we had." "And now, 16 years later, his car shows up," Margaret said. her voice tight. Dropped off by someone who looks like Jim. A heavy silence settled in the room. Then Reyes closed the file and leaned forward. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said carefully, "I have to ask, is it possible your husband left on his own?" Margaret stiffened. "No, absolutely not. We were happy. He loved Lucia. His business was doing well. There was no reason to leave." "People sometimes hide things," Reyes said gently, "even from those closest to them." "Not Jim," Margaret said firmly. "And even if, and I'm not saying he did, he would never have taken Lucia. Never." Just then, the door opened and a female officer stepped in. "Carraway's statement is complete," she said. "He's waiting in the lobby." "Thank you," Reyes replied, then turned back to Margaret and Doris. "We're going to keep digging. The car will be examined thoroughly. We'll track its movements and see where it's been over these years." He stood. "But for now, I recommend you both go home and rest. It's been a long day." Margaret checked her watch. It was already after 2 p.m. She nodded. "Yes, I think we will." "We'll have someone drive you," Reyes offered as he led them out of the room. In the lobby, Reed stood up from a plastic chair as they approached, slipping his phone into his pocket. "All finished?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret replied. "Thank you for helping today." Reyes gave him a quick nod. "We'll contact you if we need anything further." Reed glanced between the women. "I live in Hyde Park. I could give you a ride if you'd like." Reyes raised a brow. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Carraway. We can arrange—" But before he could finish, a uniformed officer walked briskly toward them, interrupting the moment. Detective Reyes was suddenly pulled aside by another officer, responding to something urgent. As he stepped away, Margaret weighed their options. Her mother looked drained, and waiting around for a police escort or a taxi could take time. "We'd appreciate the ride," Margaret told Reed, quieting the uneasy feeling in her chest. He had fully cooperated with the police, and they knew exactly where he worked. There was no logical reason to decline his offer. "I'll let Detective Reyes know," she added, and walked over to speak with the detective, who was still mid-discussion. "Are you sure this is wise?" Doris asked gently when Margaret returned. "The police have all his info," Margaret reassured her. "It'll be fine." Reyes returned shortly after, his expression reluctant but understanding. "I've got his license and vehicle details," he said. "If anything feels off, call us right away." Reed's old pickup was a bit worn but clean and clearly cared for. He opened the door for Doris, helping her in before waiting for Margaret to climb into the middle seat. "Where in Hyde Park are you?" Reed asked as they pulled out of the station. "Speedway, near 45th, Margaret replied, her voice calm but guarded. Reed nodded. "Avenue H for me. Practically neighbors. Funny we've never met before." "Thanks again for the ride," Margaret said, her voice polite. The streets of Austin were quieter than usual as they headed north. Reed kept the conversation light, talking about old stores that had vanished, how traffic had changed, and what Hyde Park used to be like years ago. Then suddenly, Doris gasped and began checking her pockets and handbag. "What's wrong, Mom?" Margaret asked, alarmed. "My inhaler," Doris said, her voice tight. "I think I left it at the Junkyard, back in Reed's office when I had that asthma spell." "Are you feeling okay now?" Margaret asked. "I'm fine," Doris said quickly, "but that's my prescription. I just filled it. I'd really hate to lose it." Reed glanced toward her. "I have asthma too, actually. I keep a spare inhaler at home if you need one. It's no problem." "That's very kind," Margaret said, "but maybe we can just stop at a pharmacy." "I don't want to buy another one if mine is still there," Doris insisted. "It's not cheap, and I've only used it once." "Going all the way back?" Margaret asked. "That's a long drive." "I really don't mind," Reed offered. "It's on me. The Junkyard's like a second home. I know the way blindfolded." "We couldn't ask you to do that," Margaret said, though her mother was already shaking her head. A taxi back there would cost a fortune, Doris replied firmly. And he's offering. Please, let's just go get it. Call me Reed, he added with a small smile. Really, it's no trouble. We'll be there and back before dinner. Margaret looked at her mother's resolute expression and let out a breath. All right, if you're sure. I am, Doris said. Okay then, Reed said, turning the truck around at the next intersection. San Marcos, here we come. It was 3:05 p.m. when they pulled back into auto salvage. The police had cleared out. Only the crushed red Cadillac remained behind yellow tape, a haunting reminder. A few employees were still scattered around, busy with parts and scrap metal. They got out and headed toward the main office, where Dean Lam stood behind the counter, his eyebrows lifted in surprise. Back again? Reed nodded. Mrs. Barrett thinks she left her inhaler during the earlier incident. Dean's expression softened. Ah, yes. I actually found it after you all left. Figured it belonged to her. I locked it in Reed's office for safekeeping. That was thoughtful of you, Doris said. Do you mind if I get it now? It's my prescription. Of course not, Dean replied. Reed's got the key. Reed pulled out his ring of keys and led them toward the hallway. I'll just grab it, he said, unlocking the door and stepping into his office. Margaret dropped into one of the plastic waiting chairs outside, clearly worn out. Doris, however, remained on her feet, pacing slowly near the doorway. How are you feeling now, Mom? Margaret asked. Better, Doris said, though her tone was distracted, just trying to stay focused. The hallway fell quiet, except for the muffled clang of metal in the distance. A few minutes passed. Margaret shifted in her seat. What's taking him so long? It's just an inhaler. Doris didn't respond right away. She stared at the office door, then suddenly leaned closer, her voice hushed but urgent. Margaret, when Reed opens that door, look across the room, top shelf of the glass cabinet. Margaret blinked. What? Why? Just trust me, Doris whispered. When he went in, I caught a glimpse. I think I saw something. A blue handbag, between some books. It looked just like Lucia's, Doris said quietly. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. That's not possible, Mom. Lucia had her bag with her when she disappeared. Just look, Doris insisted. It's the exact same shade of blue. Before Margaret could say anything more, footsteps echoed down the hall. The door to the office opened, and Reed stepped out holding the inhaler. Found it on my desk, he said, handing it to Doris. But Margaret wasn't looking at the inhaler. Her eyes were locked on something just beyond Reed, through the partially open office door. On the top shelf of a glass-fronted cabinet sat a small blue handbag. Its shape, its color, the white trim, Lucia's bag. Reed? Margaret said, her voice surprisingly calm. That blue bag in your office? He glanced over his shoulder, following her gaze. Oh, that old thing? He said casually, but Margaret noticed the way his shoulders tensed just slightly. It looks exactly like the one my daughter had with her the day she disappeared. Reed hesitated a beat too long. Really? Huh. That'd be some coincidence. Would you mind if I took a closer look? Margaret asked, already rising from her seat. Reed seemed to weigh his answer, then shrugged. Sure, I guess. It's nothing special. Belonged to my daughter. Dean, still at the counter, blinked. I didn't know you had a daughter. Reed turned sharply. She's not with us. She lives with her mom in Houston. Margaret and Doris followed Reed back to his office. He unlocked the door and reached up to the shelf, pulling the handbag down. Here, he said, handing it to Margaret. My daughter wasn't really into this kind of stuff, but someone gave it to her at school one year. Never used it. I just kept it here. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she took the bag. It was the exact model, size, and style of the one she had bought for Lucia in 1984. A small rectangular handbag, white piping along the edges, a basic clasp. Lucia had saved for weeks to buy one just like it. She was so proud. She took it everywhere. "This looks like a vintage piece," Margaret said, carefully inspecting it. "What year did your daughter get this?" Reed shifted on his feet. "Oh, I don't know. A few years ago, maybe." "It's nearly identical to a style that was popular in the early 80s, Doris added, watching him closely. "I'm surprised you'd find one like this recently." "Well, you know how fashion goes," Reed said, brushing off the comment. "Everything comes back around eventually." Margaret opened the bag. It was empty. Still, she ran her fingers along the inside lining, studying the stitching, the feel of the material. It all matched her memory. "It's in really good shape," she murmured. "Like I said, she never used it," Reed replied. "You can keep it if you want." "It's just been sitting there." Margaret looked up sharply. "You'd give away your daughter's birthday gift?" Reed shrugged. "She wouldn't miss it. If it reminds you of your daughter and helps in some way, why not?" "That's very generous," Margaret said slowly. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," he said flatly, his expression unreadable. Doris spoke up. "Didn't the police search this office earlier?" "They did," Reed replied. "I told them it belonged to my daughter, and they moved on. It's just a personal item, nothing suspicious about it." Doris took the bag from Margaret and turned it over. She pulled open the lining to examine it more closely. "There's a tag sewn inside," she said, "but there's no brand, no print. It looks rubbed off." Margaret leaned in. Sure enough, there was a small white tag where a logo or date might have been. But whatever had once been printed, there had been faded or erased. "That's odd," she said, tracing the blank tag with her thumb. "What kind of birthday gift has no manufacturer tag?" "I wouldn't know," Reed said, a hint of sharpness creeping into his voice. "It was a school gift. That's what I remember." Margaret pressed her fingers against the bag again. The weight, the texture, it was exactly the same. "We'll keep it," Doris said firmly, clutching the bag to her chest. "If that's all right." "Sure," Reed replied, already motioning toward the door. "If it gives you peace, by all means. Now, if there's nothing else, I should probably get you back to Austin." They followed him back through the junkyard in silence. The afternoon heat settled low over the twisted metal and the still cordoned-off Cadillac. At the truck, Reed stepped aside to speak with Dean. Margaret and Doris climbed in. Once the door shut, Doris leaned in urgently. "That's Lucia's bag," she whispered. "I'm certain. That tag was tampered with, to hide the brand, maybe the production year." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. But how would Reed have Lucia's bag? And why would it be in his office? "I don't know," Doris said, "but none of this adds up. First, Jim's car shows up here, with no record of who brought it. Then we find a bag that matches Lucia's exactly, on a shelf in his office." Margaret rubbed her forehead. "Let's not jump to conclusions. It could be a coincidence." "Do you really believe that?" Doris asked, her eyes fixed on her daughter. Margaret didn't have time to answer. Reed slid into the driver's seat with a cheerful tone. "All set?" He smiled as if the strange moment hadn't happened at all. "As if that blue handbag had never mattered," Margaret said with a forced smile. "Thank you again for everything today." Reed nodded and started the engine. The pickup rumbled to life, rolling away from the junkyard as the shadows of late afternoon began to stretch across the highway. Northbound on Interstate 35, the traffic was steady. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, the blue handbag resting tightly in her lap, her fingers tracing its edges again and again. Doris, in the back seat, had tucked her recovered inhaler securely into her purse, but the air inside the truck felt heavy with silence, thick with thoughts neither woman dared speak aloud. Margaret's mind raced. How could Reed have had this exact bag, and why was he so quick to give it away? "I really can't thank you enough for all your help today," she finally said, her voice quiet, hoping to ease the tension. Reed nodded without taking his eyes off the road. Happy to help. I can't imagine what it must have felt like, finding that car after all these years. 16 years of not knowing, Margaret said, her voice barely audible. And then to see Jim's car like that. Tell me about them, Reed said casually. Your husband, your daughter. What were they like? Margaret hesitated, unsure. Something about the question made her stomach twist, even though Reed's expression seemed relaxed, even sincere. But speaking about Jim and Lucia had always felt like a way to keep them present, real. Jim was a great dentist, she said slowly. He had this incredible way with kids, made them laugh, calmed their nerves. Always wore these ridiculous ties with toothprints on them. It became kind of his thing. Reed smiled faintly. Sounds like a character. He was, Margaret said. And Lucia, she was all energy, so smart, curious. Even at 8, she cared about how she looked. She picked out her own clothes, styled her hair, always wanted to feel grown up. She loved that bag, didn't she? Reed asked, glancing down toward the one in her lap. Margaret nodded. She saved up for it for weeks. It was part of a limited edition Barbie accessory line. She brought it everywhere. Without thinking, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small, creased photo. It showed Jim and Lucia standing in front of the red Cadillac. Jim had his arm around her shoulder, mustache as big as ever, both of them smiling wide. Lucia's outfit was pink, bright against the car's deep red. This was taken a month before they left, Margaret said, handing it over. Reed gave it the briefest glance. Nice-looking family, he said. Then his tone shifted, just slightly. She was missing her 2 top teeth, right? That rainbow shirt? Margaret froze. She hadn't mentioned the rainbow on the shirt, and there was no way Reed had looked long enough at the photo while driving to catch such small details. In the back seat, Doris stiffened, her silence now unmistakably alert. Yes, Margaret said slowly, carefully slipping the photo back into her purse. That's right. The rest of the ride was quiet, uneasy. Reed kept checking the rearview mirror, though it was unclear if he was looking at Margaret or the handbag in her lap. Every time she met his eyes, he quickly turned back to the road. When they finally pulled up in front of Margaret's house in North Austin, the tension broke just a little. Reed parked along the curb and smiled, though the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Here we are, safe and sound, he said. Thanks again, Margaret replied as she opened the door. For everything. Anytime, Reed said. I'm in the book, Reed Caraway. Let me know if you need anything else. Doris was already out of the truck, waiting on the sidewalk. Margaret joined her, and they both watched quietly as Reed drove off and disappeared around the corner. Without exchanging a word, the 2 women hurried up the front path. Margaret's hands were trembling as she unlocked the door. Once inside, she bolted it shut and threw the deadbolt across. Doris spoke first, her voice low, urgent. Did you hear what he said in the car? About Lucia's missing teeth? About the rainbow on her shirt? Margaret nodded, slowly sinking into a chair, the handbag still cradled in her arms. He couldn't have seen that from the photo, not in the few seconds he looked, and I never mentioned those details. Doris stepped closer, her eyes wide with fear. Margaret, is there any chance Reed knew them? Jim or Lucia? Could he be hiding something? That's a serious thing to say, Mom, Margaret whispered. We don't have any proof. But do you believe it's just coincidence? Doris asked, not backing down. Margaret didn't answer. She stared at the handbag, turning it over in her hands. If this really was Lucia's, there'd be a way to tell. She looked up, her voice growing steadier. Remember how I used to label all her things with permanent marker so they wouldn't get mixed up at school? I remember, Doris said. She hated when I tried to write on this one, though. We compromised, Margaret said, a faint, faraway smile tugging at her lips. We stuck a sticker inside the lining instead, just in case." She turned the bag gently in her lap, her fingers already moving toward the lining. "This bag style was everywhere back then," Margaret said, trying to steady her voice. "I bought Lucia the original Mattel Barbie limited edition set, but other brands made similar ones too. Kids had them in pink, purple, even green. Some were knockoffs sold at department stores." Doris nodded slowly, her brows still creased with doubt. "Even so, that's a lot of coincidences." Margaret didn't answer. Her fingers kept running across the seams of the bag, feeling the texture she remembered so well. The stitching, the vinyl, the blank tag inside, where something had clearly once been printed. "We should take this to an antique shop," Doris said suddenly. "Let an expert examine it. If it's really a vintage bag from the early 80s, they'll know. And if it checks out, we go straight to the police." Margaret nodded. "You're right. Let's confirm what we're holding before jumping to conclusions." She stood, clutching the handbag more tightly now. "I'll grab the car keys. If we head to Burnett Road, we might catch the antique shop before it closes." Doris stood as well, her fatigue replaced with urgency. "Then let's go. We need to know what we're dealing with." The sun was low on the horizon as Margaret's car pulled out of the driveway, casting a golden glow across the quiet neighborhood. She gripped the steering wheel with both hands while Doris sat in the passenger seat, the blue handbag resting carefully in her lap. "Burnett Antiques should still be open," Margaret said, glancing at the clock. "Mr. Keller knows vintage items. He's helped me before." The drive was quiet, the day's discoveries lingering between them. Jim's crushed Cadillac, the handbag that seemed too familiar, and the man who gave it away too easily. "Do you really think it could be Lucia's?" Doris asked quietly, running her fingers along the white trim. Margaret didn't take her eyes off the road. "I don't know, Mom. If it is, then Reed lied. But why would he keep it for so long?" 20 minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot of Burnett Antiques, a small shop wedged between a bakery and a hardware store. A bell chimed as they walked in, greeted by the scent of old books and polished wood. Glass display cases lined the front, filled with vintage jewelry and collectibles, while worn furniture and toys filled the rest of the space. A man in his 60s looked up from behind the counter. "Mrs. Hallbrook, Mrs. Barrett, what a pleasant surprise. What brings you in?" "Hi, Mr. Keller," Margaret said with a polite smile. "We're hoping you can help us identify something." She gestured to Doris, who gently placed the handbag on the counter. Mr. Keller adjusted his glasses and examined it. "Interesting piece. Children's accessory, early 1980s if I had to guess." He turned it over in his hands thoughtfully. "This isn't quite my area, though. Let me grab Robert. He's the expert on vintage toys and collectibles. His wife's a serious Barbie collector." He stepped through a curtain at the back of the shop and returned a moment later with a younger man in his 40s. Salt and pepper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, confident but kind demeanor. "Ladies," the man greeted them, "let's take a look." He took the handbag to a brighter section of the counter and began examining it with practiced hands. He checked the stitching, the vinyl material, and the clasp hardware before opening the bag and running his fingers along the inside seams. "What would you like to know specifically?" he asked, glancing between them. "We'd like to confirm if this is an original Mattel product," Margaret explained. "From the early 1980s, part of their limited edition Barbie accessory line." Robert nodded, then pulled a jeweler's loupe from his pocket and examined the details more closely. "The quality of the vinyl and the stitching definitely matches Mattel's manufacturing from that time," he said. "And this blue? That's part of their Barbie World line if memory serves." He turned the bag over, inspected the zipper pull. "This shape is consistent with their zippers from that exact period." Then he reached for his phone. "Let me call my wife. She'll know if this color was exclusive to a specific year." As he stepped away, Margaret and Doris exchanged hopeful glances. "He thinks it's authentic," Doris whispered. "That doesn't prove it's Lucia's," Margaret replied quietly. but it would mean it could be. Robert returned a few minutes later, placing his phone down. "She confirmed it," he said. "This bag is almost certainly from Mattel's Barbie accessory collection, limited edition, produced between 1983 and 1984. This particular shade of blue was only made for about 8 months. Doris exhaled softly, her grip on the counter tightening. Robert's expression shifted slightly as he turned the bag back over. "There's one more thing. This tag inside." He pointed to the small white ribbon sewn into the lining. "It's been tampered with." Margaret leaned in. "Tampered?" He nodded. "See here. The fabric slightly puckered around the edges. That usually means it was scrubbed or chemically treated. And here, this slight yellowing and the uneven fading." He paused, tapping a spot with his pen. "Something was printed here once. A brand name, maybe even a date stamp, but someone tried to erase it." Margaret and Doris exchanged a look of alarm. "This tag should have clear information," Robert added, "but someone didn't want it to be legible." "It looks like someone tried to deliberately erase the tag," Robert said, rotating the handbag beneath the light. "Most likely using a heat source, maybe even something as simple as a household iron." He tilted the fabric toward them, revealing a faint shadow where ink once had been. You can still see traces of where the printing was. The surface has that slightly melted, plasticized texture, typical of heat exposure. It doesn't smell like burnt polyester anymore, but the damage is consistent with that kind of treatment. He pointed to the tag's edges. "See the puckering here? The fabric around the tag is stressed. That's also a sign of high heat." Margaret's chest tightened. Could it have faded on its own over time? Robert shook his head. No. Natural fading affects the entire tag evenly. What you're looking at here is targeted. Someone wanted the information gone. He looked up, eyebrows raised. "If you don't mind me asking, why is this particular bag so important?" Margaret hesitated, then chose her words carefully. "It just reminds me of one my daughter had a long time ago. We were hoping to find out if it's the same model." Robert nodded, satisfied with the answer. "Well, I can confirm it's genuine. A Mattel product from their 1983-1984 Barbie line. My wife collects these. She'd recognize it in a heartbeat. You're welcome to bring it back when she's around if you want a second opinion." "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice wavering slightly. "You've been incredibly helpful." Robert handed the bag back with care. "Anything else you'd like to know?" "No," Doris said, reaching for her purse. "What do we owe you?" "Nothing at all," Robert replied warmly. "Always happy to help identify vintage items." They thanked both men and left the shop. Once they were back in the car with the doors shut, Doris turned to her daughter, her voice low and serious. "Someone tried to erase that tag on purpose, Margaret." Margaret looked down at the bag in her lap, her fingers brushing the edges of the damaged ribbon. "I know. We need to go to the police," Doris said. "They have to know Reed's now tied to both the Cadillac and this bag." Margaret nodded. "Even if it's not Lucia's, even if everything Reed said is true, the police should at least be aware of the connection." She started the car, her voice steadier now that she had a direction. "Let's head straight to the station. Detective Reyes might still be there." The blue handbag sat between them as they pulled out of the parking lot, its presence now feeling heavier than ever. Margaret's mind churned with questions about Reed Carraway, and what he really knew about the day her husband and daughter vanished. They had barely driven a few blocks when the dashboard lit up. "That's odd," Margaret muttered. The brake warning light had just come on. She pressed the brake pedal lightly. It felt soft. "What's wrong?" Doris asked, her grip tightening on the handbag. "The brake light's on. Something's off." Margaret tapped the pedal again, and this time it sank almost to the floor. A slow dread rose in her chest. The car began to shudder. She flicked the signal and guided the vehicle to the curb before it could stall completely. The engine sputtered and died. She tried restarting, but it wouldn't turn over. "This has never happened before," Margaret said, bewildered. She got out and popped the hood. No smoke, no fluid spills, at least nothing obvious to her untrained eye. "Should we call a tow truck?" Doris asked, joining her at the front. "I guess we'll have to," Margaret said, pulling out her phone. "There goes our trip to the station." But before she could dial, a familiar vehicle pulled up behind them. A pickup truck. Her stomach turned when she saw Reed Carraway step out from the driver's side. And then, another man exited the passenger door, taller, broader, someone she didn't recognize. "Margaret, Doris," Reed called out, walking toward them. "Everything okay? I just happened to be passing by and saw your car pulled over." Margaret forced a smile, but a wave of unease crawled up her spine. "Brake issues," she said as calmly as she could. Light came on, then the car lost power. "We were just figuring out next steps." Reed walked up, peering under the hood. "This is my buddy Jason," he said, gesturing to the other man. "He's great with cars." Jason gave them a brief nod, then leaned in to inspect the engine. "What happened exactly?" he asked. Margaret repeated the symptoms. Jason checked a few hoses, wiped his hands, then straightened up. "Brake line's leaking," he said, "and it may have impacted the transmission. This isn't safe to drive, not without a shop." "Can it be fixed here?" Margaret asked. Jason shook his head. "Nope. You'd need proper tools and parts." Reed stepped in. "Where were you heading? Maybe we can drop you off." "We were on our way to the police station," Doris said, her voice unusually firm, her purse clutched tightly against her. Reed raised his eyebrows. "The police station?" "Just following up on Jim's car," Margaret said vaguely when Reed asked. She didn't want to mention the handbag. Not yet. "Well," Reed offered casually, "I can have your car towed back to the junkyard. We've got all the tools there. I can take a look, probably fix it for less than a typical shop." "That's kind of you," Margaret began, but Doris cut in, her voice firm. "I'd prefer we go to the police station first. The car can wait." Reed and his friend Jason exchanged a quick look. Subtle, but Margaret caught it. "Mom," she said gently, resting a hand on her mother's arm, "maybe it does make sense to deal with the car first. We can always contact Detective Reyes from the junkyard if needed." "She's right," Reed added smoothly. "No point leaving the car out here overnight. Let me make a call." Before either woman could respond, Reed was already dialing. A quick conversation later, he hung up. "Tow truck will be here in 10. The next few minutes passed in tense silence. Margaret felt her mother's disapproval without even looking, and to some extent, she understood it. Yes, Reed's presence was oddly timed, and the handbag raised real questions. But he had helped them. Maybe the police could sort it out properly once they were safe. Exactly 10 minutes later, a tow truck rolled up. It had a different company logo than the one Reed had used earlier. The driver, a heavily built man with tattoos, said little as he quickly secured Margaret's car and drove off. "All set," Reed said. "We can take you two in my truck. Get this sorted at the yard." Margaret and Doris hesitated at the passenger door. Doris lingered, her eyes narrowing on the license plate. She didn't move. "You coming?" Reed called from the driver's seat. "Yes, of course," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady as she opened the passenger door. Doris finally moved, clearly against her instincts. As she climbed in beside Margaret, she leaned in and whispered just above a breath, "I don't like this. Something feels wrong. We should have called the police." Margaret gently patted her mother's hand, trying to be reassuring, but her own unease had started to grow. Why had Reed shown up so quickly after their breakdown? Why was he pushing so hard to bring them back to the junkyard? "Actually, Reed," she said, her tone changing, "I think we'd prefer to go straight to the police station after all." Reed glanced at her through the mirror, then nodded, without expression. "Sure. As the truck moved through the city streets, Margaret noticed Doris hunched in the back seat, her purse clutched in her lap. She realized her mother was shielding her phone and quietly texting. 15 minutes passed. Margaret glanced out the window. The buildings looked unfamiliar. This doesn't seem like the way to the station. Shortcut, Reed replied flatly, not meeting her eyes. Less traffic. Beside him, Jason finally turned around. His earlier casual demeanor had vanished. His eyes were cold now, calculating. "Reed," Doris said, her voice sharp. "Where are we going? This isn't right." Reed's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Change of plans. Margaret felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Jason reached beneath his seat and pulled out a compact pistol, silencer attached. In his other hand, he held 2 sets of handcuffs. "Put these on," he said, voice low but forceful. "Now, both of you." Margaret froze. "Reed, what is this?" "Do it," Jason barked, "or I use this." The threat in his voice was chilling. Margaret's hands shook as she snapped one cuff around her right wrist, then the other. Next to her, Doris did the same, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Jason leaned back, yanked at the cuffs to test them, then shoved balled handkerchiefs into their mouths before either could speak again. "That blue bag?" he said, grabbing it from Doris. "That's not yours anymore." Then came the shove. Margaret was pushed down onto the floor of the back seat. Doris was forced sideways across the seat, her wrists still bound. Reed looked back through the rearview mirror. The warmth in his expression was gone. "Be quiet," he said coldly, "or you won't see another sunrise." The truck rolled forward, away from city lights and paved roads. Margaret's heart pounded. The bag. It had to be more important than Reed had let on, important enough to warrant this. Her eyes met Doris's, and despite the fear, she read something in her mother's gaze. "I sent a message. Someone knows." Reed turned the truck onto a dirt road surrounded by dense trees. The outside world disappeared behind curtains of cedar. Dust curled up behind them. They drove for miles in eerie silence before the path opened up into a clearing. Ahead, in the fading light, stood an old, sagging farmhouse with peeling white paint and a collapsing porch. Next to it was a dingy camper trailer, weathered and stained. No other homes in sight, no other cars, nothing but silence. Reed pulled the truck to a stop about 50 yards from the weathered farmhouse and cut the engine. Jason still held the pistol on Margaret and Doris as Reed stepped around to open the back door. "Out," he said gruffly, yanking Margaret to her feet. She stumbled slightly, her legs stiff from being forced into the cramped space. Doris followed, wincing from the pressure on her joints. Their wrists were still shackled in front of them, and the cloths gagging their mouths left them unable to speak. The 2 women were marched toward the house under Jason's watchful eye. As they passed a rusted camper trailer, Margaret noticed it was swaying slightly. Someone was clearly moving around inside, possibly thrashing, possibly struggling. Reed smirked, nudging Jason. "Looks like the boss is having his fun," he muttered, nodding toward the shaking trailer. Jason chuckled coldly. "We'd better wait until he's done before we bring him new headaches. These 2 are gonna be trouble." They continued up the creaking front steps of the farmhouse. The door opened into a dim, musty space, thick with the smell of damp wood and stale smoke. They passed through a cluttered living room, then down a narrow hallway until they reached what looked like a converted office. In the corner sat an aging man with graying hair and tired eyes. He glanced up from a newspaper, his face unreadable. "Watch them," Reed said flatly as Jason removed the gags from their mouths. "We'll be back once the boss is finished." "Don't speak to the prisoners," Jason warned. "Same rules as always." Reed pulled a length of chain from a drawer and used it to fasten their cuffs to a heavy metal radiator bolted to the wall. After ensuring they couldn't slip loose, The two men turned and walked out, locking the door behind them. The room fell silent. "Please," Margaret begged the older man. "We haven't done anything wrong." "My daughter's with law enforcement," Doris added quickly. "If you help us, you'll be helping yourself. They'll treat you better." The man didn't respond. He returned to his chair, lifting his paper again, but it was clear he wasn't reading. "We're just trying to find my daughter," Margaret continued, her voice cracking. "Lucia, she and my husband went missing 16 years ago." They pleaded with him for several more minutes, desperate for even a flicker of empathy. He remained silent, occasionally glancing toward the door as though afraid someone might hear. Then the door creaked open again. The older man tensed, standing quickly, but it was only Reed returning alone. He shot the women a hard look. "Quiet," he snapped, "unless you want to get hurt. You have no idea what these people are capable of." "Please," Doris said softly. "I'm Doris Barrett. This is my daughter, Margaret Holbrook. We're looking for my granddaughter, Lucia Holbrook. She was only 8 when she vanished with her father." The man stood frozen for a moment. His eyes searched theirs, conflicted. Then he glanced down the hallway again. No one. His voice dropped to a whisper. "They call her Samantha now," he said. "But I heard the name Lucia before they changed it. That was 4 years ago." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her knees nearly gave out. "She's alive?" The man nodded slightly. "Keep your voice down." Margaret's eyes welled with tears. "Please, please help us. You're not like them. I can see it." He shook his head grim. "Being decent will get me killed." "You're already older than them," Doris whispered. "Sooner or later, we all have to answer for who we are. Do the right thing. Help her." For a long moment, the man stood perfectly still, as though time had stopped inside him. Then he let out a breath, slow, pained. "I'm doing this for Samantha," he muttered. He pulled a phone from his pocket with shaking hands and dialed quickly. Margaret could hear the whisper of numbers being spoken, followed by a rushed message. Coordinates, a location, then silence. He hung up just seconds before the door opened again. 3 men entered, Reed, Jason, and someone else. The third man was larger than the others, with a shaved head, a white tank top stained with sweat, and muscular arms marked by faded tattoos. He looked like he hadn't stepped into sunlight in years. Margaret knew instantly. This was the boss. "What are you doing in here, Micah?" the man asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You're not supposed to be near the women." Micah, the older man, backed away quickly. "They were making noise. I was telling them to shut it." The boss narrowed his eyes. "Search him." Reed and Jason stepped forward without hesitation. "If he's got anything, deal with it," the boss said coldly, locking eyes with Reed. "You understand?" "Yes, boss," Reed replied. Micah and Reed left the room. Margaret and Doris were now alone with Jason and the boss. The big man took a few slow steps toward them. His gaze swept over them in a way that made Margaret's stomach turn. "So," he said, voice low and thick, "I hear you're asking about Samantha." He reached out toward Margaret, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She flinched. "I like women with some fire," he said with a sick grin. "Not just the young ones." Margaret recoiled, her hands rattling against the chain. Margaret stood trembling, chained to the radiator, but when the boss moved toward her, something inside her shifted. "Give her back to us," she said, her voice rising with a courage she didn't know she still had. The boss let out a low, guttural laugh. "That's not going to happen," he sneered, "but I'll tell you what I can do." He turned to Jason. "Bring them in." Jason nodded and stepped out. Moments later, he returned with 3 young women, all with long brown hair and similar builds. Their eyes were cast downward, and none of them looked up. "Here's the game," the boss said, clearly relishing every word. "Pick the one you think is Samantha. No talking, no hesitation. You both point at the same time. If you're right, I'll let you see her. Just see her," he added, grinning darkly. "No promises beyond that." Margaret's breath caught as she studied the three women. All of them were the right age. All could have been Lucia, but one, standing just slightly apart, had a small scar above her right eyebrow. The same scar Lucia had gotten when she fell off her bike at 6 years old. Margaret's pulse thundered. She looked at Doris. 3, 2, 1, point, the boss barked. Both women raised their cuffed hands and pointed to the same girl, the one with the scar. "Well, I'll be damned," the boss chuckled. "Looks like blood does recognize blood." He nodded to Jason. "Take the others away." Jason quickly led the 2 other women out, leaving the 3 of them alone. Margaret, Doris, and the woman they knew in their hearts was Lucia, now called Samantha. "Lucia," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Sweetheart, is it really you?" But the young woman didn't respond. Her gaze was empty, her face unreadable, as though she were watching from somewhere far away. The boss stepped closer, his tone dropping into something colder. "Now the real fun begins," he said. "Samantha, strip!" Margaret and Doris gasped, horrified. "No!" Margaret shouted. "Leave her alone!" "Stop this!" Doris added, her voice shaking. The boss ignored them, staring directly at the girl. "You heard me. Do it." And to Margaret's shock, Lucia, Samantha, began to obey. Her movements were slow, robotic. There was no protest, no emotion, as though she had done this before, many times. "That's it," the boss muttered, then paused suddenly. "Actually, I have a better idea." He turned to Margaret with a chilling smile and reached into his pocket, unlocking her from the radiator but leaving her handcuffs on. Grabbing her by the arm, he dragged her into the center of the room, between Doris and the girl. "I like variety," he said darkly, brushing a hand down Margaret's cheek. "Samantha, undress her for me." Margaret's eyes widened. "Lucia, I'm your mother. Look at me." Lucia, Samantha hesitated. For just a second, something flickered in her eyes, but then she stepped forward, her expression still blank. "Lucia, please," Margaret begged. The boss laughed. "I like it when they struggle." He grabbed Margaret's blouse and violently tore the fabric at the shoulder, exposing her skin. Margaret cried out, not from pain, but from terror and humiliation, as his hands began to move against her will. Then the door burst open. "Boss!" Reed shouted, breathless, face pale. "The police! They're outside!" The boss froze, his mood snapping to rage. He shoved Margaret aside and grabbed Lucia by the arm. "How the hell did they find us?" "They've got the place surrounded," Reed replied, clearly panicked. The boss swore violently, then turned to Reed. "What about them?" he asked, pointing at Margaret and Doris. "Take care of it," Reed hesitated. "There's no way out. They've blocked the perimeter." With a snarl, the boss reached for Reed's weapon and yanked it from his waistband. He spun toward Margaret and raised the gun. "I'll handle it myself," he spat. But just as he pulled the trigger, Micah, the older man, burst into the room, throwing himself in front of Margaret. 2 deafening shots rang out. Micah dropped to the floor. Blood spread quickly beneath him. The boss tried to fire again, but the weapon clicked empty. "Useless," he snarled, tossing it aside. "Give me another." Before anyone could move, the front of the house exploded in sound. "Police! Drop your weapons!" Officers poured into the room, weapons drawn. Jason immediately raised his hands, so did Reed. But the boss lunged at one of the officers. A shot rang out, striking him in the thigh. He stumbled, but didn't fall. "You think that's enough?" he bellowed, laughing manically. "Do you know how many I've taken?" A second shot hit him in the shoulder. This time he went down, howling in pain. Officers quickly swarmed, subduing all three men. Reed and Jason were cuffed and pulled away. Paramedics rushed to Micah, working quickly to stabilize him. Margaret's restraints were unlocked by a female officer. She ran straight to the girl still standing in the corner, frozen, barely breathing. "Lucia," Margaret whispered, gently cupping her daughter's face. "It's me. It's Mom." But there was no spark of recognition. Lucia's eyes were vacant, her mind somewhere unreachable. Doris joined them, her own shackles removed, tears flowing freely. "We found her," she whispered, touching her granddaughter's arm. "We found her." Outside, police lights flashed against the falling night. Red and blue illuminated the trees, the field, the broken farmhouse. Officers secured the scene. Investigators moved in, and medics carried Micah on a stretcher toward the flashing ambulances. Margaret held her daughter tightly, whispering again and again, "You're safe now. We'll bring you back." Even if it took years, she would not lose her again. As police secured the scene and gathered evidence, paramedics tended to the wounded and the shaken. Margaret stood in a daze, barely noticing as Reed, Jason, and the man known only as the Boss were led away in handcuffs. Reed kept his gaze low, avoiding everyone, while Jason looked straight ahead, blank and silent. But the Boss, still bleeding, grinned like nothing had touched him, laughing as officers forced him into a waiting cruiser. "Ma'am," a soft voice pulled Margaret's focus. A female paramedic gently took her arm. "We need to get you checked out." Across the yard, Doris sat wrapped in a blanket on the bumper of an ambulance, wincing as a medic examined her bruised wrists. Margaret followed without protest, her eyes fixed on Lucia, Samantha, still wrapped in a thick blanket, seated on a stretcher, her gaze vacant and far away. "You've got a small cut here," the medic said, cleaning Margaret's shoulder where her blouse had been torn. "No stitches needed, but we'll bandage it to prevent infection." Margaret barely heard her. "My daughter," she murmured. "Is she okay?" The paramedic followed her eyes. "Physically, she's stable," she said gently, "but she's not responding to any questions. A trauma specialist will evaluate her at the hospital." As the medic wrapped a blanket around her, Doris approached, looking pale but alert. "How is she?" she asked, nodding toward Lucia. "In shock," Margaret whispered. "She doesn't recognize us, Mom." Doris laid a hand on her arm. "Give her time. She's been through hell." Suddenly, shouting erupted near the farmhouse. Paramedics rushed a stretcher toward another ambulance. It was Micah, the man who had saved Margaret. His shirt was soaked in blood, bandages pressed tightly to his chest, an IV trailing beside him. "We've got to move," one of the medics barked. "He's crashing. Get those bullets out now." As Micah was loaded into the ambulance, a young officer approached Margaret and Doris. "Your daughter needs to be transported right away," he said. "We're taking her to the trauma unit for evaluation. You'll both need a more thorough checkup too." "Of course," Margaret nodded, her eyes on Micah's ambulance as the doors slammed shut. "He saved my life. Will he be all right?" The officer paused. "They're doing everything they can. He was still conscious. The medics say he's a fighter." As they walked toward the ambulance where Lucia sat, another paramedic jogged up beside them. "Before we go," he said, "Micah gave us a few details while we were treating him. His full name is Micah Carraway. And Reed? That's his son." Margaret stopped in her tracks. "His son?" The paramedic nodded. "And the man you called the Boss? Charlie Carnes? He's Micah's stepbrother. Reed said Carnes pulled him in young." Doris shook her head. "That poor man, betrayed by his own family." "We'll have detectives speak to you at the hospital," the paramedic added. "But we've got to move now." They climbed into the ambulance where Lucia sat, unmoving, eyes lost in a distant place. As the doors closed and the sirens wailed, Margaret reached out, her hand trembling as she touched her daughter's fingers. "Lucia," she whispered, "it's Mom. You're safe now." There was no response, no flinch, no tear, not even a blink. Margaret turned to Doris, panic creeping into her voice, but Doris just gently squeezed her shoulder. The rest of the ride passed in silence and flashing red lights. At the hospital, they were separated. Lucia was rushed to a treatment room while Margaret and Doris were examined. Once cleared, they were escorted to a quiet consultation room. Margaret sank into a chair, her body and mind heavy with everything that had happened. "I still can't believe it," she murmured. "We actually found her." Doris nodded beside her. "It's like a miracle, but she's broken, Margaret. What that man did to her—" Margaret closed her eyes, trying to block out the memories of the farmhouse, the chains, the fear, the way her daughter had stared past her as if she weren't even there. Minutes passed before the door opened and Detective Reyes stepped inside. "Mrs. Halbrook, Mrs. Barrett, I'm glad you're both safe. It's been a hard day." "Have you spoken to my daughter?" Margaret asked immediately. Reyes shook her head. "Not yet. Doctors are still evaluating her. She's physically fine, but emotionally, they're concerned." "What about Micah?" Doris asked. "The man who helped us." "He's in surgery," Reyes answered. "The good news is the bullets missed anything vital. The doctors are hopeful." "And the men who took us?" Margaret asked, her voice firm. "All three are in custody," Reyes confirmed. "We've secured the handbag as evidence and are now investigating the junkyard owner for possible involvement. Reed and Jason are cooperating." "Did they say anything about Jim and Lucia?" Doris asked. "What happened all those years ago?" "We're still piecing it together," the detective said, "but we recognized Charlie Carnes right away. He's a known serial predator who's been off the grid for decades, changes identities, moves frequently, preys on the vulnerable." She paused. "He keeps women under his control through fear and abuse, often for years." Margaret felt sick. The thought of her little girl surviving under his hand for 16 years was unbearable. "How did he meet Jim and Lucia?" she asked, needing to know. "Reed's been opening up," Reyes said. "He told us he was just 10 when it happened. He idolized Carnes, his step-uncle, thought he was invincible. Charlie had presented himself as the kind of strong, commanding male figure Reed had always admired, so unlike his own father, Micah, whom Reed considered weak and poor." Detective Morales paused, glancing at her notes. "According to Reed, they were near Marble Falls when they spotted your husband's Cadillac. They posed as stranded travelers. Charlie told Jim that Reed was his sick son, and Jim, being the man he was, offered them a ride." Margaret covered her mouth, tears welling. That sounded just like Jim, always compassionate, always trusting. They ended up staying at the same motel in Llano. Morales continued gently. Jim even gave them the adjoining room. That night after dinner at a nearby diner, Charlie drugged Jim's drink. Once Lucia was asleep, he killed him in the bathroom. Strangled him. Doris let out a choked sob. Margaret gripped her hand tightly, her whole body trembling. Charlie then made it look like Jim had left on his own. He told Lucia her father had been taken to the hospital and that they had to go. He took her, using a hidden car nearby, and over the years manipulated her, told her her mother was gone too. With fake documents and by moving constantly, he erased her past. Margaret's voice cracked. "And Jim's body?" Reed said they stayed behind to clean up. They removed all evidence. Charlie dumped Jim's body in a limestone sinkhole. The Cadillac? They drove it deep into the woods and left it there until last week. "Why now?" Doris asked softly. "Reed brought it to the junkyard," Morales replied. "He finally cracked, said he'd carried the guilt too long and wanted to make it disappear for good. He didn't expect anyone to recognize the car after 16 years. Margaret sat in stunned silence. Her husband, murdered the first night. Her daughter, lost for 16 years. The life they could have had, stolen. We'll do everything we can to recover Jim's remains, Morales said gently. Reed's been cooperative. We have a good idea of where to look. Before Margaret could reply, a doctor entered. Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Barrett, your daughter's been moved to a private room. She's stable. Still not speaking much, but I believe having you with her may help. They followed the doctor through the halls to a quiet room. Lucia lay in bed, pale and motionless, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Though 24 now, she looked impossibly small beneath the blankets. Margaret stepped forward, Doris close behind. Lucia, she said softly, taking her daughter's hand. It's Mom. Grandma Doris is here too. No reaction. Margaret kept speaking, reminding her of birthdays, bedtime stories, silly family jokes. Doris joined in, tears falling as she talked about the way Lucia used to twirl in the living room, dancing to nothing at all. Then, just as Margaret began to wonder if they were too late, Lucia whispered, I'm so sorry for being so broken. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. You have nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart. None of this was your fault. You're safe now. I miss Daddy, Lucia said, a single tear slipping down her face. The way she said it, Daddy, broke Margaret's heart. It was the voice of the little girl they'd lost, frozen in time since the day she vanished. I miss him too, Margaret whispered, stroking her hair. A nurse appeared at the door. Excuse me, Mr. Carroway is awake. He's asking to see you. Margaret hesitated, not wanting to leave Lucia's side, but Doris gently touched her arm. Go. I'll stay with her. In the next room, Micah lay in a hospital bed, pale but alert, his chest wrapped in thick bandages. Mrs. Holbrook, he rasped, I need to apologize for my son and for myself for staying silent. Margaret walked closer. You saved our lives, she said. If not for you, we'd still be in that house. We might never have found Lucia. Micah's eyes closed briefly. Reed hated gentlemen like me, saw them as weak. He looked up to Charlie. And when they tricked your husband, it was because they knew Jim would help. Kindness made him a target. I know, Margaret said, voice low, and I don't blame you. She reached out and gently took his hand. There's nothing to forgive. Leaving Micah to rest, she returned to Lucia's room. Her daughter was asleep now, her face calm, more peaceful than it had been since they found her. Doris sat on one side of the bed, watching over her with silent tears. Margaret took the other, sliding her hand into Lucia's. After 16 years of agony, false leads, and faded hope, they had found her. There would be pain, there would be nightmares, but they would face it together. Step by step, day by day, love, Margaret knew, would guide them through the darkness, and in her heart, she silently thanked the forgotten trail that led to a crushed red Cadillac and a blue handbag that brought her little girl back home.